just wanted to thank the American Bar Association for organizing this panel and inviting us to speak about such an important topic. So I'd like to begin by giving a brief overview of the legislative history, which has brought us to the point where employment for disabled people has seemingly become a universally accepted value. And by this I mean everyone seems to agree that extending equal opportunity to disabled people to achieve employment is a good thing to do. Then I'd like to consider the gap between that value and the actual state of employment for disabled people, reflected in the statistical data regarding employment and income. I'll then close my talk by offering a conceptual framework for understanding what it means to empower all, which is the theme for this year's National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So when summarizing the legislative history and the achievements of the disability rights movement, I think it's important to understand that the Americans with Disabilities Act, like most of the legislation preceding it, is not an affirmative action law. It doesn't give special privileges to disabled people. It only protects civil rights, the rights to not be discriminated against, and the right to have an equal opportunity to participate in public life, including employment. It doesn't guarantee equal outcomes, nor does it give any special advantage to disabled people over non-disabled people. And this is why one of the important slogans of the movement was, and still is, disability rights equal civil rights. And historically, civil rights were being violated. Just to give one well-known example, it was in 1907 when the first forcible sterilization law was passed in Indiana. And similar laws were enacted in more than 30 states, typically targeting people with disabilities, especially intellectual disabilities, psychiatric conditions, and epilepsy. And in 1927, in response to a Virginia sterilization law, the Supreme Court ruled that forced sterilization of, quote, mental defectives, end quote, is not only constitutional, but also desirable. Incidentally, Virginia did not end its sterilization program until 1979. Now, this case is not about employment, but I'm referencing it today because I think it's crucial to highlight a particular social attitude toward disabled people that interprets them as a societal burden. In the past, this attitude was explicit. Today, I'm here to tell you, though, that this attitude still does exist, albeit implicitly and in more subtle forms. And directly relevant to employment discrimination is the case of the League of the Physically Handicapped, which was formed in 1935 to protest the exclusion of disabled people from jobs created by the Works Progress Administration. This fight for the legal right to work would continue until the passing of the ADA in 1990, less than 30 years ago. And for me personally, I'm lucky to have been only 5 years old when the ADA was enacted. Without it, I can pretty much guarantee you that I would not be here speaking to you today. Now, it was during the 1960s when major civil rights legislation was being enacted. Broad classes of people were receiving legal protections: women, racial minorities, religious groups, etc. But people with disabilities, the largest and most discriminated against minority class in the United States at that time, did not receive protection under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The 70s and 80s were a little better for disabled people. In 1973, we got the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibited disability discrimination by federal executive agencies and recipients of federal funding. In 1974, the last, quote, ugly law was repealed. These were laws that permitted the arrest, detainment, and fining of people with, quote, unsightly or disgusting disabilities. There was also the passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1975, the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act in 1980, the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act in 1984, And finally, the extending of protection to disabled people under the Fair Housing Act in 1988. Now, passing the ADA in 1990 was obviously the crowning achievement of the disability rights movement, but we shouldn't forget how long it took to get equal civil rights after other groups were given protection in the 1960s, because it indicates social attitudes and beliefs about disabled people that still exist today. Now, there are many ways that we could analyze these attitudes and beliefs, but since our topic for today is employment, I think we can look at the relevant statistical data to get a sense of the gap between our stated values regarding disability employment and the real employment situation for disabled people. Despite the passage of the ADA almost 30 years ago, the numbers for employment and income are discouraging. According to the American Community Survey, in 2016, an estimated 36.2% of non-institutionalized people with a disability between the ages of 21 and 64 were employed. The employment rate for non-disabled people was 78.9%. That's a difference of over 40 percentage points. If we narrow that employment rate to full-time employment, only 23% of disabled people are working full-time, compared to 59.4% of non-disabled people. Median annual earnings for disabled people who were working full-time was $40,300. Non-disabled median earnings was $45,000. Now, that seems a little better, but keep in mind that full-time employment for disabled people is 36 percentage points lower than that of non-disabled people. Where you really start to see the gap in income between these two groups is in affluent areas of the United States. For example, in Washington, D.C., median income for disabled people is $45,000. That's $5,000 higher than the national median. But for non-disabled people, the median is $70,000. So clearly, disabled people are being left behind in the most economically prosperous parts of the country. In 2016, median household income for disabled people was $43,300. It was $68,700 for non-disabled people. 26.6% of disabled people were living below the poverty line, compared to 10.9% for non-disabled people. In DC, 14.5% of non-disabled people were below the poverty line, compared to a shocking 40.6% of disabled people living in poverty here in this city. 9.7% of non-disabled people have less than a high school education. It's twice that high for disabled people. So these numbers don't look good, and it leaves us with the question of what accounts for these differences. Now, I'm a realistic person, and I should state at this point that I don't believe that these statistics could be made equivalent simply through the provision of equal opportunity alone. Obviously, there are restrictions on employment opportunity depending on one's disability. I, for example, am restricted in doing jobs that require hand-eye coordination. That's a lot of jobs, and it has made it difficult in the past for me to get a job. I realize other kinds of restrictions exist for other disabilities that cannot be overcome through equal opportunity alone. I think it's important to acknowledge this fact because the most common objection to the kind of argument that I'm making is that these statistics are determined by more than one factor. I absolutely believe that this is true. However, I absolutely do not believe that a difference of 40 percentage points in the employment rate is mostly the consequence of personal limitations. So, what is it the consequence of? I think answering this question requires an accurate conception of what disability is. Disability is not primarily a personal limitation, or in other words, a disability is not reducible to an impairment. So my eyes are impaired because I have a genetic mutation that is causing my retinas to deteriorate. But whether or not I can navigate around the city is not solely or even primarily a matter of impaired retinas. Disability has a social dimension to it, and it's impossible to understand any limitation that arises from a disability without accounting for the social factors that contribute to it. Now, this might seem like common sense to many of us today, but it was not that long ago that disability was viewed only as a biological and medical problem. Conceptualizing disability as a social phenomenon was one of the most important insights of the disability rights movement. It was so influential that the World Health Organization incorporated it into its international classification of functioning, disability, and health in 2001, after a decade of efforts to revise the classification system to better reflect the social dimension of disability. I'd like to read a passage from this document that nicely summarizes the difference between social and medical conceptions of disability. Quote, "A variety of conceptual models has been proposed to understand and explain disability and functioning. These may be expressed in a dialectic of medical model versus social model. The medical model views disability as a problem of the person, directly caused by disease, trauma, or other health condition, which requires medical care provided in the form of individual treatment by professionals. Management of the disability is aimed at cure or the individual's adjustment and behavior change. Medical care is viewed as the main issue, and at the political level, the principal response is that of modifying or reforming healthcare policy. The social model of disability, on the other hand, sees the issue mainly as a socially created problem, and basically as a matter of the full integration of individuals into society. Disability is not an attribute of an individual, but rather a complex collection of conditions, many of which are created by the social environment. Hence, the management of the problem requires social action, and it is the collective responsibility of society at large to make the environmental modifications necessary for the full participation of people with disabilities in all areas of social life. The issue is therefore an attitudinal or ideological one, requiring social change, which at the political level becomes a question of human rights. For this model, disability is a political issue." End quote. So, with this social understanding of disability in mind, I would argue that most of the gap in the employment and income data has a social cause, and I would further argue that these social barriers are typically not obvious. I mean, it's hard to see a normal physical structure, workplace practice, or social attitude as a barrier because they are just that, they're normal. This means, consequently, that most of the discrimination that disabled people experience in employment is probably not intentional. But unintentional discrimination is discrimination nonetheless. The ADA is broad enough to cover what it calls disparate impact, the exclusion or segregation that may result from architectural, transportation, and communication barriers, paternalistic rules, unnecessary eligibility criteria, and failure to provide equal opportunity to people with disabilities. So if we truly want to empower all when it comes to employment, I would say it's not good enough to merely adopt the value and wait for disabled people to show up. The opportunity to work is not yet equal. But thanks to the ADA, I think we are headed in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Caleb, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and the statistics are unbelievable. And we look at that all the time. And just a little about our company, because some people might say, who is Northrop Grumman? We're a defense contractor that really provides and builds security systems, both in outer space, on land, and undersea, to protect all individuals. So we're located here in Falls Church, Virginia. but that just gives you a little idea of who we are as a company. We have approximately 86,000 employees throughout the world, and we've recently acquired a new company, Orbital ATK, now known as Innovation Systems. Thanks. So what I'd like to do is read the vision of Northrop Grumman as it pertains to our workplace accommodations and our employees. So that it says, promote a barrier-free workplace in support of building the best culture, which maximizes contributions of individuals of all abilities and raises Northrop Grumman's both internal and external profile as an employer of choice. So Northrop Grumman, I will say this, it starts with our leadership, the incredible support from our CEO. Right now, as a defense contractor, or you don't even have to be defense contractor, but we have skill sets that are critical, that we can, and we need all talent and the best talent. So it is difficult when you talk about cybersecurity, you talk about software developers. It used to be we would compete with our competitors in defense contracting, but we're competing with everyone, the Googles, the Microsoft, the financial institutions and all. So talent is important to all of us. So we are very focused on hiring disabled, LGBT, all different demographics that exist to support our business. So I'd like to give you an overview of initially our workplace accommodations. And I'm very privileged here today to have Samantha Yang, who's in the audience, and she's our workplace accommodations manager who actually started this organization. So to give you a set is 86,000 employees. We have one manager, one coordinator, and 3 reps. And the reps are based throughout the United States. And when we first set up this organization, we assumed that we would have maybe 500 requests a year. Well, we have on average more than 1,300 employee requests a year for accommodations. So to tell you what types of accommodations are, the highlights are the requests for our job limitations or restrictions. We have alternate work schedules, and one that has, I'd say, come to the top more so is the modified desk workspaces. And a lot of it people would like to have, but do they need it and have an accommodation? And so those are those sit-stand desks, and that's a popular request for us. One of the lessons learned that we see in the organization is you really need to manage the customer's expectations. A personal example is I have an employee who is wheelchair bound with a dog who is in one other location in the company, but now we're moving her to another location, and construction has to take place to accommodate her needs. Example, the bathroom needs to be modified. So it's not something that happens overnight, but we had a person come in, give an estimate, and it's going to take more than 4 months to reconstruct the bathroom. So we gave her a choice to either stay at her current location now until we could accommodate her, or to work from home, and she elected to work from home. So you really have to manage what it takes, such as when you're ordering supplies, and how with the supplier, if it's a popular tool or resource for that employee, and it might take 2 days, 3 days, versus might take a month. So it's managing not only the employee, the manager, that you have to constantly communicate. With the construction, the purchasing, and being a defense contractor, we always, with software, have the InfoSec. We always have to go through InfoSec for the approval when we're talking software and providing software, I'd say, tools and resources, that it is meeting our expectation and the requirements. But when you step back and say, well, what's working well in our organization, it's the online request. Now, there's a variety of online requests. If someone has a computer, they can go online and make that request for the accommodation. But if someone doesn't, they can fax it, they can call in, and someone in our human resource call center down in Texas can actually manually take in the information from you for the request that you need and fill it in for you. So we have whether it's phone, fax, actual having a voice or going online. So we have a variety of formats to make that request. Now, the requests that we have are more than just for employees. They're for visitors, and another request might be, and Samantha's done a wonderful job in developing the website, where if a person needed a lactation room and was on business travel and needed a lactation room, if we have someone coming in from overseas and needs a prayer room, then you can go online and identify the location you're going to see where that lactation room is, or the prayer room, or whatever that you need, making that request for the accommodation. One thing that we learned, and I strongly encourage this for all companies, is to have a centralized budget. We used to have our budgets embedded in the programs. Well, and then if an employee, and we found that employees were very tentative in asking for the necessary accommodation that they needed to provide or to work well with their job, that because it was being deducted from the budget of that manager. So we centralized it up into the corporate office. So people are more, as you can see, when we estimated 500 requests in a year, and we have more than 1,300 a year, people are more comfortable in making those requests that they need. It is confidential, of course. And so that is one thing I strongly recommend, is that you think hard about centralizing your budget into one place that is is private, and that the accommodation staff will work with you. The opportunity areas is always for Northrop Grumman. If you think about it, we have thousands of buildings, whether it's at a customer site, whether we lease the building, and right now we own some buildings, but not a lot. So what's the accessibility? That's a key focus area. So under attorney-client privilege, if we are going in to lease a building, we might have an audit to go into that building that's leased to really evaluate the accessibility for our employees or for visitors to that building. The big thing is the buttons on the doors and the level, the counters, of the heights of the counters. So we do that an awful lot and have an outside audit companies that go around to all of our buildings. And then when it is at a customer site, we'll talk to the customer and see how accommodating they can be. And of course, it's a requirement. Another area of opportunity is when you're dealing with electronics and you're looking at the information, the documents. Training is important, and that's where I think we've really set the bar high for everyone. Our training, we have to be responsible. The training isn't just for the employee, but it's the awareness for the managers, and it's the employees who are working with the employee who needs the accommodation. And of course, you'll talk to that employee who needs the accommodation to say, how much can we share, so that we can go out and it can be a very strong building the best culture for that, both the employees who are working together as a team, so that people can help. We have a person now who comes to visit us from time to time who has a dog, and we always are aware of that so that we can have people. Now, usually Bob will want to do it himself, but we'll always try and accommodate to say, do you want us to take Waverly out, and have at a particular site if it's at a new building and Bob isn't familiar. So again, we do a lot of video captioning. That's a big thing right now, especially when we have a lot of leadership meetings. We have people who come in and do sign language a lot, and we decide, some people might need it face-to-face only, and we have the video caption up there when people are showing their slides or talking up on stage. So those are things that we've really, it's just, I'd say, become a normal way to make sure that you have the sign language, the video captioning for our employees or outsiders. So that's an overview. But let me tell you a little about some of the programs that we have that have made a difference. We have this Accommodate tool, and that I talked very briefly about, that you can go on and make requests for your accommodations. We have a self-ID program, and from time to time, I'd say every 2 years, we repurpose it or just do something different. And the big thing with the self-IDs, and as a government contractor, we have a requirement to hire so many vets, to have so many disabled people in our company. So we decided to do personal stories, people in the company who were disabled, who were LGBT or vets, and interview them on why they should self-ID. Because a lot of people don't want to, because especially people with disabilities, people have to trust that it's going to be confidential, and they don't want to ever be asked, what's your disability? And there's very few of us who have access to those databases. But we found by having that personal story from individuals in those 3 categories and why it was good for them to self-ID made a difference. In fact, in one of those categories, by having those videos show throughout the company, it increased our representation by 100% because it was a trust. So that is one thing I say, take the personal stories of individuals on why it's important to self-ID and put it out there, and I'm sure that your representation will increase. Another thing we have to assist in another program is, and we're very well known within not only the government and the military, but Operation Impact. It's for our wounded warriors who are designated to be 33% or more disabled. And we hire them, or we hire a wage earner in their family in Northrop Grumman to make sure that our military folks are, have those resources to live a life. Now, with that Operation Impact, we've done this for over 12 years. It comes with extras. You need to make sure that you have the infrastructure that really, because there is one-on-one caring, that I have a specific Operation Impact function within my organization, that it's a requirement for one of my specialists to touch base with every month or every other month, every Operation Impact person to see that everything is going well. We have a nurse assigned to them, so if they need any assistance, or when they're ready to say they're interested in finding a promotion in the organization, we work. So there's more care and feeding with this group of people, and they're so appreciative, not only their spouses or that significant other wage earner, they themselves, and they're in all different jobs within Northrop Grumman. We have, of course, regulatory programs. We always know that what gets measured gets done. So we have our executive compensation on a monthly basis. Our presidents of the organization meet with the CEO and their direct reports on reporting out what their numbers are as far as their hires and the retention of people with disabilities. So there is a dashboard that is constantly looked at, and discussions are had. And we do a lot of benchmarking, training. We have a lot of partnerships, and that is critical because you can share best practices or you can share your practice. I'm pleased to say that Northrop Grumman is ranked number 2 in the area of disability as the top employers from Diversity Inc. And so we do go out and talk a lot about the sharing. I know since our time is limited, and I can always stay later and talk more specifics if anyone has it, or they can email me at Northrop Grumman. I'd be more than happy to share more. But other things that we have is the strategy. So let me give you some ideas of different places that we really focus on. I talked about the leadership commitment. Wes is always out there speaking about how hiring people and hiring the best talent is critical to our organization. 2 weeks ago, Northrop Grumman sponsored the annual National Organization on Disability Annual Summit, and he was a keynote speaker, and he was very, very committed and shared, of course, what Caleb said, and it was so sad to me, is what the unemployment rates for the disabled are. But we at Northrop Grumman are interested in all people with all abilities to make sure that we have, the right skills and abilities to build and provide those services that Northrop Grumman does throughout the world. Accommodation accessibility programs, you heard some of what we have. Supplier diversity and mentoring. Our supplier diversity does target companies that are are run by disabled people, and we have what we call mentor-protege programs, where there's a lot of mentoring to set them up for success in a defense contractor and how to manage. So that's called mentor-protege. And I'll say out of the 12 employee resource groups we have what we call VOICE. It's Victory Over Impairment and Challenge Enterprise. It's our employee resource group. And I'm proud to say that they are the strongest employee resource group that we have out of the 12 in the company. In fact, the chair is going to be presenting in the next 2 weeks at our Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Council, which is our CEO and direct reports to our CEO, and talk about how they've made a difference in the last year for Northrop Grumman and for our employees. Because actually, if they see something that's not right at Northrop, such as an accessibility issue, they'll give us a call and we'll look at it, analyze it and all. And they also bring disability programs in, whether it's people with diabetes, people with heart conditions. We'll bring in subject matters, or they really do bring in the subject matters to have webinars across the organization. So we're looking at all disabilities, and they also help support and provide that. They also give us feedback on making us aware of what their needs are in the area of benefits, and we might need to modify our benefits to support certain disabilities that are out there. Education, I talked training. We have unbelievable amounts of toolkits that we provide both managers, employees, or the people who are making the request. Recruiting and hiring, we were at the USBLN, now called, it's a new name, Disability In, and we made a lot of hires at Disability In. We were very successful with those hires. We talked about partnerships and outreaching and benchmarking, which is critical. Make those contacts, make those connections so that you can share those best practices so that you can use them. So again, Northrop Grumman values all people of all abilities. When you request an accommodation, let me just give you a real quick highlight on, we have a centralized workplace accommodation, a team, and a centralized budget that supports the request and the fulfillment. They accommodate the online request. Employees, applicants, investors, anyone who comes in can make that request in a Northrop Grumman facility. And we talked about how it's emailed, it could be a call or a fax. We have an unbelievable website out there, and I encourage you to go on to learn Northrop Grumman's website. So we also have computers and certain technology and provide that is needed. One thing that managers, when we do our disability training, is people don't realize a lot of the accommodations are not expensive. They're a minimal request. We see that with whether someone needs a mirror, someone needs certain technology on their phone. It's not that expensive. So it's easy to get it when they need it. So I'm going to stop there because I can go on and on and on, and I have a lot more to offer, but I know that we want to share everything, but I'm here again either by email or after to talk more about our programs within Northrop Grumman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm very impressed by your accommodations centralized database. We don't have that at Sidley. I don't know many places that probably do, but that sounds really fantastic. Thank you. So I'm Beth Colby. I'm an associate at Sidley Austin. I've been there for 6 years. I also was a summer associate there, so born and raised in Sidley, as we say. I want to talk a little bit about the accessibility issues when I started, and then kind of what Sidley has done since then. I really think Sidley has become a model of a law firm in terms of accommodating and recruiting, retention, all of the important factors of people with disabilities. So I think one theme kind of and what I'll talk about today, though, is that it's really not just one thing. A law firm can't just, or an employer in general can't just focus on access and think that they'll be able to recruit talented people with disabilities. It's really a multi-pronged approach. So, of course, it's access. You need to make sure people can enter your building and read your website with a screen reader, but it's also critically important that you have people who are involved in recruiting who have an interest in recruiting people with disabilities, and then also retention. So once you get people, to make sure that they are accommodated if they need to be, if they need an accommodation, or just that they're thriving and happy and successful at the law firm. So when I started, I only have one not even bad story about Sidley, but one thing that happened in the beginning that I'll share, and that is when I started, there was only one floor with push-button doors, the 8th floor. All the other floors, didn't have them. And I think this is probably true of most law firms, but our groups are seated together, so you kind of want to sit with your group typically. And my group, forever and always, the healthcare group, has been on the 7th floor primarily, and I was on the 8th floor because that was the only one with a push-button door. And as a first year, I was really excited to be there. Big law. I was really happy to join the firm, and so I didn't want to raise any flags or complain. But my group took it amongst themselves to say, no, she should sit with us. You just need to get a push-button door on 7. And they did, of course. So they moved me back so that I could sit with my group and put a push-button door on the 7th floor. They've since remodeled and put push-button doors on all of the floors. So that's been really fantastic. I'm one of 2 people with a physical disability, someone who uses a wheelchair in the office, but I see everybody using those push-button doors. Everyone has their roller carry bags with briefs and whatnot to prepare for court, and everyone uses them. So I think it's kind of a universal design issue. But since I've been at Sidley, since they've known I've needed access, they've been just incredibly fantastic and supportive. So I'll kind of now transition to some of the things that Sidley has done, and I think that other firms can look to and potentially do as well. So I already mentioned the physical access, making sure that there's push-button doors, no stairs, things like that. We also recently hired a consultant to make our website more accessible so that it can be viewed by anybody, but particularly students perhaps who are interested in working at Sidley. So we have, I think we're 85% accessible at this point via screen reading, and we're continuing to try to make it 100%. In terms of access, we also have standing desks for everybody, actually. And I showed up one day and there was one in my office, and I use a wheelchair. So I thought it was kind of funny, but I actually do love it because I just adjust it a little bit.
Well, it's everyone loves it, wants it, but
yeah,
when you have 86,000 employees.
Yeah, we are a little smaller than that. So access is definitely the first step. But I think one thing I've been really proud of at Sidley is the recruiting efforts to make sure that we can recruit talented individuals with disabilities. We've done that in a few ways. First, we've always had a fantastic diversity scholarship program for our 1Ls and our 2Ls. Previously, it lists the types of diverse applicants that can apply, and disability previously wasn't explicitly listed there. Of course, if a candidate applied with a disability, I think that they would have been considered, but I think it's important to just have that in the diversity statements to make it clear that you include disability in your diversity initiatives. So that's great. We do that now for 1Ls and 2Ls. Also, I'm very involved in recruiting. I recruit at my alma mater every year, but then also do callbacks and interview with lots of people. I think having someone with a visible disability active in recruiting is really helpful to have, to let the students know that it is a welcoming place. The firm does support and find value in people with disabilities and hiring that type of diversity. So I've really enjoyed being a part of that. Since I've started, we've hired a number of additional people with disabilities, and I'm really proud. I'm a former Paralympian. I swam in the Beijing Games in 2008, and we just hired another Paralympian for this incoming summer class, so I'm really excited about that. of course, then once you get them, you need to make sure that they're happy and successful and continue to stay at the law firm. And I think Sidley's done a lot to improve retention efforts for people with disabilities as well. So one of the big things that we did just last year is start an affinity group. We, of course, have a diversity committee, and there are some subgroups that meet as well within the diversity umbrella, but previously we did not have one specific to disability. So we just started that last year. We meet quarterly, and it's been really great. I've learned that there are a lot more people at Sidley with a disability than I thought. Obviously people don't always disclose. And so there are many people with invisible disabilities that I did not know, were part of my clan. So it's been really great to just see how many people have joined these meetings. Although we also made it clear that you don't have to have a disability to join the affinity group. We wanted to be open so people don't have to self-ID if they don't want to. So we said, you're welcome if you have a disability or if you're just interested in these types of issues. And I think that was the right choice so that people don't feel like by showing up they're necessarily disclosing.
We call those allies.
Yes.
Allies. So if you support, you might have a child who has a disability.
Definitely, yeah. And there was actually a partner who spoke at the affinity group meeting last time who had a daughter with a disability. Another thing is our diversity committee, or our diversity staff did a training specifically about people with disabilities and about accommodations. One thing that I think can be a struggle is figuring out what kinds of accommodations are appropriate for people, particularly maybe if they don't disclose having a disability. So we brought in an outside consultant from a nonprofit organization to help brainstorm what types of accommodations might be appropriate. So for example, because my accommodations are relatively straightforward, like I can't have stairs anywhere, but for someone maybe who has a type of learning disability where maybe there's more typos in their email or something, like how can you accommodate them in a way that's still seamless and giving great client services and things like that. So we brought in an outside expert to help our diversity staff with those issues as well. We also have a strong mentorship program. So I have a mentor as part of the diversity program, but he specifically has a disability as well. So that is just fantastic as well. And then lastly, Sidley does a lot of diversity events and makes it clear that disability is part of that. So for example, we have diversity dialogues every year for our summer class, and we pick a topic every year. And for the ADA anniversary, we had a big ADA celebration. And I think for a lot of people, it was the first time that they really learned about the history. We had panelists from the White House, from DOJ, and from a nonprofit, the Association of University Centers on Disability. And they did a lot of what Caleb did, which I think was fantastic, of talking about the history and kind of how far we've come. And I think that was a really fantastic event that got a lot of people to show up, and I think interested in disability issues. So with that, I just wanted to thank you so much for inviting me, and if you have any questions about my experiences at Sidley or some of the activities that Sidley has done, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, we're on here.
Hi. First, I would like to commend Bob and the Commission and Amy and her staff for arranging this, but especially to our three panelists for presenting a remarkably effective topic that we will be thinking about as time goes on. Caleb presented some disheartening statistics, then Kimberly advised us of how a model firm can do things with best practices, and then Beth told us how that can be applied in a law firm in particular. So this was an especially helpful discussion. My question is probably for Caleb, but for any of the three of you. The Americans with Disability Act has been around for 28 years, and you pointed out where we are today. Do you have a projection of where we will be in 28 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard to say, but one thing I can tell you is that the center has been open since the mid-90s, and our the amount of trainings that we have to do have been going down over the past couple of decades because the ADA is becoming more integrated into our daily lives. People understand it more. There was a lot of confusion early on, a lot of misconceptions about it, like what I mentioned about it being an affirmative action law. But I think that is getting better, and employers, I think, are becoming more aware. I'm really glad to be on the panel with Kimberly and Beth because they work for employers who are doing a really good job, and I think that probably is becoming more of the norm. I think that in 28 years, things will be much better, provided that disabled people continue to see themselves as an interest group and continue to apply political pressure because that's kind of necessary. I mean, it doesn't really, it ultimately doesn't matter if you have the law on the books if there's no one who is defending it. So provided that disabled people continue to be politically active, I do think that things will just continue to get better, decade by decade.
And I'll echo that and say thank you all very much. You really gave us a lot to think about. Most of you spoke about what kind of accommodations and what to do once you have the job. As somebody who's retired from the military, whether it's an invisible disability or somebody who's got a learning disability or something, those people going through their transition process and looking for a job, at what point? They may not have to reveal it. It might not be a visible disability to reveal during the interview, but at what point in that process do they find out, is this really the place for me? Can you accommodate maybe minor disabilities or maybe minor challenges or even major ones, but do they do it to the HR? Is it confidential? Do you have any tips for somebody going through the job search process?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Before starting at Sidley, I was president of the National Association of Law Students with Disabilities. I think that's one of the most common questions that they get is, when do I self-disclose if it's an invisible disability? How will I know if it's a good fit if I don't do that? Honestly, I don't think I have any fantastic answers because I think it's such a personal decision. But at Sidley, at least I think having people with disabilities being visible in the process, I think is hopefully can give applicants some comfort that, that the place would be accommodating and appropriate for them. But in terms of when, I know I disclosed right away to the HR representatives. Of course, it was obvious to my interviewees, but I wanted it to kind of be known more broadly as well. But I understand that mine's different than many and that mine cannot be hidden, which I'm fine with.
When people come in during their new hire orientation, we have members of the ERGs, employee resource groups, who talk about the employee resource groups, which will talk about the voice, which is people allies of disabled or disabled themselves. So they have that first introduction, but we also have an awful lot of programs out there on webinars and that people know about the workplace accommodation website, or they can talk to their boss to make that accommodation, or HR. There's different avenues that it's a lot about education because when you first start, even before you start and they send you all these papers to fill out online, or after you come in, you're still inundated. So I believe it's really an ongoing awareness and education. But also some of the people might become disabled later on in life that are already employed at Northrop Grumman, who then absolutely know what they well, their doctors will tell them, or they know that better than other people who are managing that program, what they need, what services they need to be even better in their job. So, I think that's it depends. It's always depends, but we do educate at the new employee orientation when they come in about the different services that we do offer. They have the website, and I think it's also the visibility of seeing others, and there's that connection that occurs.
Thank you. Good afternoon. A great program. I have a question because Caleb talked about financial opportunities and the lack of income. So I wanted to know, in terms of how challenging is it in terms of growth opportunities in your career, for people with disabilities? Are you given the prime projects? Are there challenges that you can talk about in terms of, because things like that, people think that you are limited. So I just wanted to know, is that something that you have challenges with in your environment, and how do you address that for people keeping you on the equal playing field?
Let me just share an example today. Today, Northrop Grumman has, and I just came from there and I'm running back after, the affinity program. And they're focused on 6 affinities within Northrop Grumman: LGBT, people with disabilities, veterans, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. They have several hundred people in a room right now, and they break out, and you break out based on your affinity. And so, and some, who were invited, they do have hidden disabilities. We call it a cohort program. It is for high potentials. And so I believe no matter who you are, you're given the same and equal opportunity. And if there is, we do a big thing right now that we've pushed, my staff has really pushed for that education, is talking about the program unconscious bias. And so by rolling this unconscious bias out and having these open discussions, it's been an aha moment for a lot of leaders and managers within the organization of their bias that they didn't realize they had. So it's out there. And we have, let's say if someone believes that they're being discriminated against, we have different avenues that they can go forward. They can talk to employee relations or HR, or we have an open line that is completely confidential that they can say that I believe that I'm not being fairly treated. So, but I'm very proud to say that I think that people are given the same and equal opportunities at Northrop Grumman based on their abilities. And it's also, what do you want? You have to also, talk about, I want this next job with your manager. Don't be timid and all, and no matter who you are, is to say, and what will it take for me to get that next job? So it's that you have to self-promote, and you have to talk about what it is you want in your career. And a lot of times, if you're performing, you'll have that opportunity. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think that to answer that question, it really depends on the region of the country that you're in, and also the kind of profession that you're in. For me personally, I don't think I've ever experienced that, but I've been lucky enough to work in jobs where my disability is not discriminated against. So I haven't been passed over for any projects or anything like that. I think that I think that the main reason for the disparity in income starts earlier than that. I think it starts when disabled people are children and they're in education. It's difficult to get the kind of education that puts you on the career path to end up in a job where your disability is not an issue. I mean, to end up at a place like Northrop Grumman, you really do have to, from an early age, you got to be on a really good trajectory in your education. And I think that's where a lot of disabled kids are getting left behind. And so that just compounds itself throughout one's life. So that statistic I mentioned about, how twice as many disabled people don't have a high school education. If you keep going further out, these statistics don't really change. Less disabled people have four-year degrees, less have master's degrees, so on and so forth. So I would say that's where the real issue is. So I don't think that discrimination is so explicit anymore, and I don't think that people generally are intentionally discriminate. I think that the discrimination has become more structural, and if we want to do something about that, I think we got to do more when it comes to educating children who have disabilities.
And just to add on those points, I also feel extremely lucky at Sidley. I am given fantastic work, and I've been successful there. I think two kind of points. One is my mentor and the partner who gives me a lot of work in the healthcare group himself has a disability, and so I think from early on he didn't see it as a barrier at all. But then second, the self-promotion thing I think is really important. So early on, it became clear that some partners weren't sure if I could travel well, if there would be difficulties with flying, if I would need help. I think they just didn't know, and I took it on myself to make it very clear. No, I want to go to that client site. I want to travel with you to the court. I made it clear that I wanted to and that I could do those things, just because I think that they were unsure.
Any questions from Chicago? Chicago, are you there? Okay. I have one question talking about affinity groups, but we divide people up into groups, but relatively you could have you could have someone who is LGBT and has a disability. So how does that work? Instead of just categorizing people, if you have people whose diversity is intersecting,
Right.
how do they participate, or do they participate, or how do they pick one versus the other?
Well, this affinity program that's ongoing for the next 2 days, you can pick whatever affinity you want. And what some did last time we had it is they were a veteran, disabled vet. They went to the veterans one day, and they went to the disability one the next day. One thing, and this has been ongoing, we've done 7 different affinity programs, and every time we do it, it evolves and it gets better based on the feedback from the employees. And one thing that was wonderful is, we broke them out into groups. They talk about the challenges they had, and they helped each other try to solve it, or just talk about it. And we have executive vice presidents who are in these meetings who represent that affinity themselves, and they can give some pointers. And we're not there to change them. We're there to help and have people self-reflect. So we learned that the affinities came back and said, we don't want to be in these rooms all the times and then come out and just hear the report out. We want to help each other. We want to know what their challenges are, or what your challenges are, so that we can help each other and building that best culture that Northrop Grumman really wants and stands behind. So there's a lot more dialogue, and they have a choice to pick whatever affinity they feel comfortable and change midstream, go morning one, and afternoon in the other, and keep bouncing. I mean, they could have have an affiliation with 4 affinities, but it's up to them how they want to go for those 2 days.
Because we found that millennials are less into the categorization
Yes,
of
yes.
what group they fall into.
Yes,
And they want to see diversity as like a holistic approach.
yes.
Where everybody, comes together, rather than I'm over here with disability, but I happen to be LGBT, or, I'm African American, or so there's all this intersectionality
Right.
going on.
And we talk about the different dimensions of diversity. That is a big thing. It's not just race, ethnicity, gender, but it's everything. It's what you bring to the table. And I always say when I speak, you are, that relationship is so key, that networking. You are as much alike as you are different, because I'll bet you there is some similarity with each individual, whether it's blue eyes, whether my dream is to jump out of a parachute, whether I went to this college or I'm from this region. There is some connection that can be made when people listen to each other and learn more about the personalness of that individual.
Yeah, just building on that, Sidley has a very active associate-run diversity committee. They're the ones that really do most of the programming. I think we have monthly, if not more often, meetings. The smaller affinity groups meet much less frequently, and so you can definitely, go to any of the smaller affinity group meetings, but everyone also participates in the diversity committee, so that's kind of the umbrella.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
So I guess this would be so I guess this is mostly for Kimberly, but for any of you, I suppose. So have you ever encountered a situation where there are mutually exclusive accommodations necessary? And if so, how do you deal with it? The classic example being one person has a guide dog and somebody else is deathly allergic to dogs. But I've also encountered situations where people need meetings at mutually exclusive times. One needs it very early, one needs it very late, or any situation like that. How would you approach that and grant accommodations accordingly?
I've been faced with that. We had, someone had a guide dog and some people were allergic to it. So we moved the person's office to accommodate the person who had that allergy. But they were close enough to where it was happening to their function, but we just had to make a change. So you work with both. It's like, okay, what is it that you need? Especially with perfume too. Example is perfume, the allergy to perfume. We've sat and we've talked to people to say, there's a person who's sensitive, chemical sensitivity, could you please not wear perfume? And we've done that before to make sure that there's no, that it isn't an issue for anyone.
With all of your inclusivity efforts and with Sidley as well, for invisible disabilities, are you seeing a lot more people coming through, self-disclosing, being more comfortable,
Whether it's mental health or, whether it's epilepsy or some other, or even learning disabilities, which a lot of people may be reticent in the law to disclose. And so how do you make people feel comfortable? Have all these programs done that? Have you seen an uptick in people participating in the programming that you all offer?
You want to start and then I'll.
Sure. Yes, I think that there has been a definite uptick. I think with the creation of the disability-specific affinity group, I have seen a lot more people with invisible disabilities come forward. And I think one part of that, which you already had mentioned, but is the personal story piece of it. So we send out, our Chief Diversity Officer sends out a diversity newsletter every quarter. And in the last quarter, it talked about the new disability affinity group and highlighted one of the partners who's in the group who has a disability. And I think that is just another way of making it more acceptable, having people be more comfortable about disclosing. And I think it has made a difference. And we're continuing to push to self-disclose, of course not pushing people if they don't want to, but encouraging people, letting them know that we do support that.
I'd say yes, I have. I'd like to see more than what's actually happening. There's a trust building that you have to do in the organization, and what I see is and our leadership is out there. It's not only our CEO, but it's vice presidents. And our CEO takes every one of his direct reports at least once a year, if not twice a year, to some diversity conference. And they speak, they do workshops. I mean, it gets to a point where we have leadership that wants to be so involved in these diversity conferences, you have to say, Okay, we're already booked, that's enough, or thank you for coming, and, I'm gonna give you 2 hours back. I have enough leadership in this room to talk to our employees when we do roundtable discussions. So I see a lot more leadership, as you see more leadership and passion out there, and it comes down, and then we also have our voice, our ERG, which is known in other areas as the affinity group, that I see more of a trust being built in saying that self-disclosure. And when those personal stories are said, why it is advantageous to self-disclose, because we want to know also, and as I said, there's less than a handful who have access to who's disabled, who's LGBT in the company. So, and when we get the specifics and we look at our employee feedback from the survey, and I'll tell you verbatims, people are very open with what their needs are, what's going well or what's not going well when you have an employee survey. And we cut and slice the demographics all different ways so that you hear what's on the minds of the employees. We do focus groups to see if it's working or if it's not working and how we can modify programs. We have other functions that are also out there supporting topics of disability, whether it's our employee assistance program, whether it's our work-life solutions programs, but these are webinars and constant communication out there. Sometimes it's too much and people say, no, I didn't see that, but we just keep pushing it out there. But I see there's been a lot more trust being built in the organization and that the culture. We talk a lot more about inclusivity, empathy, and listening to people, and just on and on based on what our annual employee survey is telling us. So it's training and education constantly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.